Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Rise of China, The Great Leap Forward by Epic History, the newest episode in the series. Now last time, we saw how China handled the Second World War, then the Civil War between the Nationalists and the Communists, which ended with the Nationalists losing and fleeing to Taiwan. Now we're really at a turning point in Chinese history. The Communists now have full control over the country, and we're going to see exactly what they do with that newfound power. If you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. The east is red and the sun rises. In China, there emerges Mao Zedong. The People's Republic, 1949. Here we go.
China, 1949. From Peking's Tiananmen Square, Communist leader Mao Zedong has proclaimed the establishment of the People's Republic of China.
And like I said, this is a turning point in modern Chinese history. Throughout this series, we have seen the struggle, in many ways, for a modern China, the struggle against the Qing dynasty, all these different ideological movements, communism, liberalism, nationalism. For the last couple of years, there of course has been pretty intense warfare, not only between China and Japan, but also between the nationalists and the communists, who at times were allies, but that alliance was always pretty shaky, and they were often at each other's throats, after once upon a time being more united under Sun Yat-sen. Well, now the communists have finally won that battle. They have gained complete control over mainland China. Now, of course, the nationalists are still in Taiwan, but as you can see, the communists control a lot more territory, a lot more people, even if they're not officially recognized by the West yet. They will be eventually. This is a really important point in really reaching the China we know today.
A new age for China.
Yeah.
For the Chinese Communist Party. And for Chairman Mao.
Yeah.
He has devoted his life to revolution and to his dream of transforming China.
Yeah, I mean, this is really all the efforts of the Communist Party having come to fruition, right? Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, all these communist leaders have been fighting for years and years for a communist China. You know, they've been literally fighting. They've governed different pieces of territory. Well, now they have the opportunity to really show what they're made of, right? Now they have the opportunity to do what they've always wanted to do, which is govern China as a communist country, right? To essentially have things their way at a national level, right? So we'll see how that's going to play out.
Now is his moment. Mao's government calls itself a People's Democratic Dictatorship. But democracy is not on the agenda.
Well, yeah, you could sort of tell that by the name. A People's Democratic Dictatorship. Even the title itself is a little oxymoronic, right? Doesn't necessarily work.
Instead, the heart of government is the Central Committee of around 100 senior party members. Above that, the 12-strong Politburo. And within that, the Politburo's Standing Committee.
Yeah, I mean, you've got this structure which it's not exactly the same as the Soviets, but you see a lot of similarities there, where you've got these governmental bodies, and you're sort of, I mean, there's a reason it's drawn as a pyramid. You're getting smaller and smaller as you go up, and more powerful as you center in on these few really influential individuals.
Where true power lies, there are 5 members, including Liu Shaoqi, a veteran labor organizer who studied in Moscow. He is now vice chairman of the Communist Party. Zhou Enlai, a hero of the revolution, once Mao's superior within the party, but who has now publicly and privately committed to Mao's leadership.
Yeah, and I think, Zhou Enlai is probably the number two in all of this. I mean, Mao is, of course, the most famous individual of China during this time period and of the communist movement, but Zhou Enlai, he's the number two. He's the second most famous. He's the favorite of many people, right? But he's someone to keep an eye on. He's very influential and will play a big role in the years to follow.
Charming and polite, he has shown a great talent for diplomacy and will serve as Communist China's first state premier and foreign minister. And Mao himself, chairman of the Chinese Communist Party and paramount leader. Aged 55, Mao now wields unchallenged personal authority.
Yes, and by the way, let's highlight the personal authority. Because as we go through the years, Mao is not always going to have the highest sort of official position, but what matters far more than whatever position he had was his personal authority. He was the unquestioned leader of the party. Now, there will be sort of ebbs and flows. We will see moments when Mao is a little less powerful, but throughout his career, and especially in this moment, he is the unquestioned leader of the party. Whatever his official authority is, people listen to him.
The result of his inspiring leadership in the struggle against the Japanese and nationalists.
Yeah.
Though never a natural orator, Mao is a charismatic figure, capable of deep intellectual thought, shrewd political tactics, and stirring writing.
Yeah.
Since 1938, he has been married to his fourth wife, the famous actress Jiang Qing. She is a powerful personality in her own right.
Yeah.
Ferociously loyal to Mao, and scathing of his rivals.
Yeah, once again, keep an eye on her. She's going to be important in her own right.
Or imagined. After years of revolution, invasion, and civil war, China is impoverished and in desperate need of reform and rebuilding. The Communist Party gets to work immediately to impose a vision on the country that is heavily inspired by Soviet thinking.
Right. And you can sort of think of China in this moment as the early Soviet Union, right? Where the early Soviet Union, they went through World War I, which was devastating, then the Civil War, which was also devastating, and so this young Soviet government was left to fight a civil war and then work out what to do after that, to work out how to govern and to really rebuild the country. That, in many ways, is the situation that Communist China is in. They've gone through the devastating Second World War, the devastating Civil War, and now the communists have control. They're left in a position to try and figure out, all right, how do we reorient ourselves? How do we rebuild our country after this devastation?
To this end, around 10,000 Soviet advisors arrive in China to assist in reconstruction. The country remains an overwhelmingly agrarian society. In 1949, by rough estimate, every fifth person on Earth is a Chinese peasant.
Wow. Holy.
They have long provided the base for communist success in China, wooed by the promise of land redistribution, which has been enforced in communist-controlled areas since the early 1930s.
Right. It's sort of interesting because when you look at the early Soviet Union, that was also an overwhelmingly agrarian society. And you had some socialist parties that appealed to those rural peasants. But the Bolsheviks weren't really one of them. The Bolsheviks were always more oriented towards the urban proletariat and the soldiers, right? So, though, of course, those rural peasants remain a big part of Soviet society, and you will see industrialization with the USSR, industrialization with China, for the Bolsheviks, those peasants were never really their main base of support. With Communist China, it's a different story. The rural peasants are Mao's main base of support. He really draws his influence from them, and they really listen to him, right? A big part of that is about land redistribution. right? That is the number one issue for most of these people. And Mao, he really had built his career with these rural peasant communities, right? So in some ways, USSR, China, are in these early stages are similar, both very rural, both will trend towards industrialization, but in other ways different, right? Mao's movement really is a peasant's movement. Now, of course, students are also very involved, industrial workers, and all these different kinds of people, but he really does find his base of support with the rural peasantry.
Now it is to be rolled out on a national scale. Rural landowners, who have dominated the Chinese countryside for centuries, are vilified for abusing their power over peasants.
Yeah, and there's a lot of resentment and animosity there. Once again, sort of similar to the landowners or the kulaks in Soviet Russia, where you will see some people who really do not actually own that much get caught up in the persecutions and tortured or humiliated and killed. Then there are also a lot of these communities where the local landowner is hated by the peasantry, and they will really take any opportunity, and that's what this is, an opportunity to humiliate them, oftentimes commit violence, and sometimes even kill them.
They are publicly humiliated by the communists, put on trial, and executed in huge numbers.
Yeah.
More than 1 million are killed.
Whoa. Sheesh.
Their land is seized and redistributed. Over the next 3 years, about 300 million peasants receive land for the first time.
Wow. Just incredible numbers there. The scale that we're talking about is massive.
Early reforms are intended to fundamentally reshape Chinese society.
And I will say, the land redistribution, it was really the biggest thing here. And if you look back on, say, Marx and some of your more orthodox Marxists, they always felt like revolution would come from the urban proletariat. I believe it was Marx who referred to the peasants as a sack of potatoes, as in they're inert. They will never be a revolutionary force. And that's sort of how the Bolsheviks felt as well in Russia. Now, they had to contend with the reality that most of their country were peasants, right? But once again, they were not their main base of support. But at this point, it's been proven pretty wrong, that idea from Marx. You saw it in the Mexican Revolution, right? Where a lot of these leaders, like an Emiliano Zapata, really organized the rural peasantry around this idea of land redistribution, right? There's an example there. And so at this point, land redistribution has become a big part of many sort of socialist or communist type movements. And that's absolutely the case here in China.
New laws improve the rights of women and protect their role in the workforce. To improve literacy rates of just 20%, the government promotes the use of simplified Chinese characters. Huge propaganda drives in theaters, public storytelling and posters aim to both educate and indoctrinate in communist revolutionary values.
Well, that's the benefit of controlling the state education system, and people have realized this since really there were state education systems, is that, well, you control what is being taught and how it's being taught. Gives you an opportunity to include a bit of propaganda or indoctrination there. I mean, even in what you might consider more neutral systems of education, a lot of countries will still teach some sort of civics or civic patriotism or whatever. Now, you can determine whether that's harmful or not, but you control the state education system. You, to a certain degree, control the indoctrination or propaganda. I know those are pretty loaded words, but you control what people are being taught, usually.
Suspected counter-revolutionaries, such as nationalist sympathizers, corrupt officials, and capitalists, are to be reported and eliminated.
And I will say, we haven't really gotten to it yet, but this is where things get out of hand, right? Where you have sort of these terrors, and you see this, say, during the French Revolution, during Soviet Russia, where these atmospheres of fear are created where everyone is worried they might be labeled a counter-revolutionary, right? And, people are pretty quick to label those they don't like as counter-revolutionaries. Once again, you saw that during the Reign of Terror in revolutionary France, right? People who really had committed no offense being labeled as counter-revolutionaries and executed. You saw that in Soviet Russia, or the Soviet Union, I should say, especially under Stalin. People were terrified, and you're going to see a very similar thing here in China under Mao.
The campaigns upend China's traditional class structure, humiliating and impoverishing bourgeois and middle-class families. The number of victims is impossible to quantify.
Right.
But hundreds of thousands suffer loss of status, confiscation of property, or imprisonment. Some are even forced to take their own lives.
The atom bomb is a paper tiger which the US reactionaries used to scare people. From Mao. That's an interesting quote. I haven't heard that one before. He's almost right. I'd say he's kind of right in that, as in the US used the atomic bomb twice, right, on Japan. And that was meant to show what the bomb could do so that the US didn't have to use it again. And up until this day, we have not used it again. Now, who knows where the future will go? But, I'd say Mao was right. The US was not going to use the bomb, in which case it is perhaps more like a paper tiger. But there have been a lot of people, a lot of politicians and generals since then who have wanted to use the bomb, like MacArthur in terms of the Korean War. So he's kind of right. Where he's not quite right is there have been a lot of U.S. officials who really have wanted to use that bomb, in which case it's not really a paper tiger. It's a weapon that, is potentially extremely destructive, but it has not been used, right? So there's some truth to that, but, I'd say not entirely accurate. China in the world, 49 to 53.
China's new communist leaders seek to build alliances abroad. But World War II has been followed by the Cold War. And the world is now divided between a democratic, capitalist West and the Soviet-led communist bloc. The Western powers offer no support to communist China.
Yeah, and it's interesting if... I was going to say if this had happened in a different time, maybe things would have been different, but you think about the rise of the Soviet Union following the First World War. I mean, or during the First World War, that was pre-Cold War, but the Western powers were extremely hostile to the USSR, so China probably never would have been treated that well by the Western world, but especially in this moment. We've gone from a time during the Second World War where there was an alliance between the capitalist West and the communist East, right? The USSR and the US were two great allies fighting Nazi Germany. Now, there was a lot of suspicion among those allies, and a lot of people felt that alliance would not last. Winston Churchill, for example, sort of foresaw a lot of this coming. He wanted to be a lot harsher against the communists at that time, but, they were still working together. You had the Western powers even sponsoring a lot of communist guerrillas and fighters during the war, and the communists backing non-communist fighters, right? For example, you had the Western powers, including Churchill in particular, backing Tito in Yugoslavia, right? It's sort of interesting to think about, given the Cold War would erupt only a few years later. Well, not really erupt, but slowly emerge. Though, of course, Yugoslavia was always more in the middle than a lot of these Eastern Bloc countries. Anyway, getting away from the point, China's emerging into a world where it has allies, right? The Soviet Union and its sphere of influence, but it's also got a lot of natural enemies with the capitalist West.
In fact, they continue to recognize their wartime ally, Chiang Kai-shek, as China's legitimate ruler.
That's right. The Western powers, and of course, when we talk about the Western powers, you're oversimplifying. We're largely talking about this U.S.-led coalition, right? So we're talking about the United States first and foremost, and the allies of the United States. We might talk about NATO, for example. And so the US is going to continue to recognize Taiwan, or the nationalist government in Taiwan, as the legitimate China. They will retain their seat on, I believe, the UN Security Council for years to come. It's going to be a while. And so the US is sort of playing, diplomatic fantasy, where they say, no, communist China's not the real China. The nationalists are the real China, which is, plainly doesn't make much sense, but that's how they're sort of trying to separate, mainland China from any sort of legitimate diplomatic relationship.
Authoritarian nationalist government, officially known as the Republic of China, still holds Taiwan and small islands in the Taiwan Strait. Inevitably, it is to the Soviet Union that Mao turns.
Yeah.
In December 1949, he travels to Moscow for 3 months of talks with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin.
Yeah, not so surprising that, the Chinese communists turned to the Soviet Union. I talk about some cases on the channel where you have countries or revolutions that may not have always leaned towards the Soviets. Like, for example, the Cuban Revolution. Initially, Castro and the Cubans tried to find an ally with the U.S. When the U.S. rebuffed them, they turned towards the Soviets. Similar with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh first turned to the liberal West. When they rebuffed him, he turned towards communism. This is not really one of those cases, partially because Mao has been fighting for years already. There's already a relationship with the USSR, and it's already pretty clear that turning to the West is not much of a possibility in this moment. He's not going to find many allies there. Yet.
Their relationship is not an easy one. In imposing his own brand of communism in China, Mao has often overruled his Soviet-backed rivals.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, in February 1950, the two leaders sign a treaty of friendship, alliance, and mutual assistance.
I mean, I'll just point out, you can see in this image here sort of Stalin and Mao presented as two equals shaking hands, right? I think in many ways that's how Mao would have seen it, right? You've got Maoism here in China. We do things a little differently. Stalin, he would have rather it been him at the top with everybody underneath him, right? He was pretty strict about that sort of thing. He wanted all of his allies and all his Eastern Bloc puppet states to follow his brand of Stalinist communism, right? And so he was not always thrilled with Mao, because Mao really had his own thing going on out in China, right? With Maoist communism. You saw in that poster a moment ago, I think it said Marxist, Leninist, and Maoist thought, or something like that, right? So Mao has really got his own ideology, his own sort of cult of personality, which is something Stalin had as well, and that would create tension between the two. And over time, that tension is going to grow, even if they are allies in the moment. And even after Stalin, of course, that tension will grow.
Unlocking economic and military cooperation between China and the Soviet Union.
Yes, but in the moment, it's clear that they need to be allies, right? I mean, China rebuilding, it desperately needs support, economic support, political support, and it really must turn to the USSR for that. And for the USSR, they don't want to, in this moment, they don't want to alienate the biggest communist power other than themselves, right? I mean, in terms of population, that must be the biggest, I imagine. I don't have the statistics. In terms of sort of influence and power, China will be the second sort of biggest communist power. The Soviets don't want to alienate them. So at the moment, even though there's tension, it's an obvious alliance to make.
By the 18th century, the Qing dynasty had added several remote western territories to its empire. Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet.
Uh-oh.
But in the tumult following the 1911 revolution, they had escaped Chinese control. Now the communist government acts to reimpose central authority. In 1949, the People's Liberation Army is sent to reoccupy Xinjiang. In 1951, Tibet is occupied and annexed, followed.
And of course, what we're seeing here will seed issues far into the future, right? Especially in Xinjiang and Tibet. Those are still massive political issues for China today.
Following a short conflict, the Chinese government euphemistically calls the peaceful liberation of Tibet. As part of the settlement, the Dalai Lama is allowed to remain at the head of a local government. No attempt is made to regain Outer Mongolia, which is now within the Soviet sphere of influence.
Right.
Taiwan remains a major source of contention.
Yeah, and will remain a major source of contention to this very day, right? As with Tibet and Xinjiang, with Taiwan, what we're seeing here are really the roots, or maybe not the roots, but what we're seeing here are issues that are going to continue until right now.
Both the communists and Chiang's nationalists continue to denounce the other side as bandits and their governments as illegitimate. Elsewhere, China's borders seem settled. But in 1950, the People's Republic of China faces a major conflict on its doorstep.
Uh-oh.
The Korean War. After World War II, Korea had been divided into two separate states, a communist north and democratic south.
Classic. They really love doing that in this time period. Okay, I guess it's, you had the partnership between the Soviets and the US falling apart. We've got this country, let's just split it in two. Vietnam, Korea, just make half of it communist, half of it capitalist. We'll just do that. Okay.
In June 1950, Northern forces invade the south, advancing rapidly and capturing Seoul within a week. Korea becomes a Cold War battleground. Under US leadership, UN troops intervene in support of South Korea. By the end of the year, they have pushed the front line back to the Yalu River.
I mean, here you really see the Cold War heating up, right? The West has gotten, the US especially, have gotten directly involved in this conflict on the ground, right? I mean, many people felt this would ramp up into open warfare between the global major powers. We know it didn't, but this is the Cold War heating up, you could say, really for the first time in a big way. I also wonder if anyone in the comments, anyone from Korea or China, I'd be interested to hear how y'all remember the Korean War today, maybe how you learn about it or how you think about it, because I have to say, in the United States, it's often remembered as it's thought of as the forgotten war, precisely because it is not remembered. As in the Korean War, in the US at least, was so overshadowed by the Vietnam War. That is remembered as the sort of the U.S. war of the Cold War, I think. It has much bigger cultural impact in America than the Korean War does. Now, the Korean War is obviously very important, but just in our sort of cultural memory today, it is very much forgotten, overshadowed by the Vietnam War to come. So I'd be interested to hear how people from elsewhere, how you remember the Korean War differently.
To the North Korean-Chinese border. Fearing a US-led invasion and hoping to shore up a communist ally, Mao sends in Chinese troops.
And this is it heating up even further, right? So you've got the US and its UN allies involved, North and South Koreans. Now you've got China getting involved, right? I mean, this is where, and we'll see if we'll talk about MacArthur, this is where it really had the potential to escalate into a major power conflict.
Support North Korea. More than 1 million Chinese troops enter the battle, soon rising to 2.5 million. In the face of this onslaught, UN forces retreat south. After months of heavy fighting, the war enters a stalemate. Both sides dig in along the 38th parallel. In 1953, an armistice is agreed, and this becomes the heavily fortified border between North and South Korea, known as the DMZ.
What a productive war, huh? I'm glad all that happened. Now, the thing I was mentioning with MacArthur is that General MacArthur, right, made famous by the Second World War, especially his actions in the Pacific Theater. He was essentially President Truman's point man for this. MacArthur, he was kind of going crazy. He wanted to keep going into China. He wanted to fight the Chinese in China. And at one time, he wanted to use a nuke, I believe against China, if not against the Koreans. Now, Truman shut him down because that is an insane idea. But when I was saying earlier about, some of these U.S. generals and politicians legit wanted to use it, MacArthur is maybe my number one example of that in this moment, right? And this was a moment when the U.S. hadn't used the nuke only a few years before. This was a moment when it was to be decided, I think, whether the nuke really was going to be a paper tiger, something that was used and then never again, for now, or was it something that was going to be used frequently, which I think would be really, really bad. Fortunately, Truman, though I've got my critiques of Truman, made the call that was not a great idea and we should not use a nuclear weapon. But that's what MacArthur wanted to do. And for that, by the way, Truman was constantly accused of being too soft on communism. Maybe not for the nuke in particular, but the sort of dynamic between them was seen. MacArthur is the strong anti-communist warrior, and the soft, liberal anti-communist Truman keeps shutting him down. Right, that didn't help Truman.
Demilitarized zone. For China and for Mao, the Korean War is presented as a triumph. They have championed the global socialist cause and stood up to the US superpower. Perhaps even more importantly, communist legitimacy within China is greatly bolstered.
Yeah.
But it comes at a huge cost. The Korean War claims an estimated 3 million lives.
Ish.
Chinese military casualties are more than 500,000, possibly many more. They include Mao's own son, Mao An-ing.
Oh, wow.
Killed in a UN airstrike while serving with Chinese forces. In its efforts to curb the spread of communism, the US has now imposed a total trade embargo on communist China.
Yeah, well, all of this was really the sort of US policy of containment, right? That's what they called it at the time, where they were like, communism can exist where it already exists, but it cannot spread any further. We must contain it. We must contain it in China and the USSR and Eastern Europe. And so in North Korea, they want to contain it in there as well. Of course, later we'll shift to the sort of domino theory. It's pretty related to the idea that if one of these countries falls, all of them will fall to communism, which really doesn't make much sense. But the US here is really literally trying to contain China.
The war has also strengthened US support for Chiang Kai-shek's government in Taiwan.
Yeah.
With President Truman sending the US 7th Fleet to deter a potential communist attack.
Yeah, once again, you see the roots of future political issues. I mean, if you had to ask me, where will the Third World War break out? There's a couple of different places I would choose. I mean, the Middle East. But Taiwan might be one of them, right? Now, I know the people of the US do not want war with China. I don't think the people of China do either. I can't necessarily speak for all of our politicians, right? I think it's, not a good idea, right? But who knows, right? You never know what's going to happen. That would be a really, truly tragic turn of events. But it is a really high site of tension, we'll put it that way, between the U.S. and China today. It was then. Let 100 flowers bloom. Yeah, here we go. We've got a big moment. First 5-year plan, 53 to 57.
In 1953, China's government introduces its first 5-year plan, inspired by similar economic programs in the Soviet Union. One aim is to swiftly and massively increase Chinese industrial output.
Yeah, and you gotta say, when you look at the 5-year plans of the Soviet Union, I mean, obviously I will not speak to the morality of someone like Stalin. He was truly a repugnant individual, led to the countless unnecessary death of many. But one thing I will say is that he really did increase the industrial capacity of the Soviet Union. That's the thing those 5-year plans were effective in doing. They really supercharged Soviet industry, not without a cost, right? I'll make that clear once again. But they did, over time, turn the USSR into the industrial superpower it became during the Cold War. And that's one of the only reasons it could compete with the US. I mean, of course, the Soviet Union will collapse in the end, but it puts up quite the fight for decades. And one of the only reasons it could do that is because it industrialized so quickly under these 5-year plans. And so now China wants to follow a similar path. And like with the Soviets, it's not going to come without pretty substantial costs.
Huge efforts, backed by Soviet technical expertise, produce remarkable results in transport, industry, and infrastructure. Production of coal, iron, and steel all exceed their ambitious targets.
Wow.
While China becomes a major oil producer for the first time. The second aim of the 5-year plan is to rapidly boost agricultural output. To this end, the Communist Party pushes farmers to collectivize on a massive scale, forming cooperatives that include dozens, sometimes hundreds of households. By 1956, 80% of peasant households belong to a cooperative, meaning they share the land, tools, and harvest. Cooperatives also have an ideological aim: to tighten party control over the lives and thoughts of rural communities.
And once again, you'd had a similar process in the Soviet Union, not without some pretty substantial resistance. Even though in Russia and some of these Soviet countries, there have been models of collective ownership going back, a long way, right? At least back to the Middle Ages, if not prior to that. But there was definitely resistance to that Soviet collectivization, but it did occur over time.
At breakneck speed, communist reforms are overturning a rural way of life that's centuries old, and sowing the seeds of disaster. Mao is encouraged by the apparent success of the first 5-year plan. Hoping to encourage further innovation, in 1956 he announces, "Let 100 flowers bloom, let 100 schools of thought contend." It is an invitation for others to come forward with constructive proposals for the government.
Crazy moment, by the way. We're going to see how all this goes, but, you couldn't really imagine Stalin doing something like this, and we might see why. So Mao, who was leading essentially a personal dictatorship revolving around his cult of personality, right? So like Stalin, says, you know what? I'm open for constructive criticism. Bring it on. I mean, that's not necessarily what he was asking for, but he's saying, hey, bring on your commentary. Let me hear it. Okay, we'll see.
In response, criticism of the party comes flooding in.
Yeah.
From intellectuals, academics, and scientists. Mao and the leadership are dismayed and angered.
Uh-oh.
Rather than welcome proposals, they move to crush what they now regard as dangerous dissent.
Yeah.
A new anti-rightist campaign punishes at least 500,000 men and women who are considered insufficiently loyal to the party.
I guess they really didn't expect the sort of criticism they received, because they sort of asked for it, and then that leads to this immediate crackdown, which is going to have pretty widespread consequences. And I'll say, when you look at, say, the Soviet Union, of course, there are times when it was more or less open. Under Stalin, it was very closed, not open. The further you get away, the more open it gets. But maybe an equivalent, or not equivalent, but you can think, say, of someone like Gorbachev, very late in the history of the Soviet Union, and he does something in some ways similar, where he sort of opened things up and says, hey, we're gonna, let you look at how things work, we'll let you contribute to the political process, speak your mind, and all of that leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think in part because Gorbachev was not willing to crack down the way that Mao and his allies are going to here.
Penalties include...
Because, look, once the criticism starts and the flood starts coming, it can really get out of control. And so, are you going to accept that? Or are you going to crack down harshly? We see what's happening here.
Who are considered insufficiently loyal to the party. Penalties include public humiliation, hard labor, and execution.
And we'll see a pretty common trend here throughout communist Chinese history. Along with the executions, they mention hard labor. A lot of sort of university-educated individuals, scientists, professors, being essentially sent off to the countryside to go do some labor on the collective farms out there.
Among the leaders of...
And that's a trend that will continue and be used in a couple different ways over time. We will probably see more of that. We definitely will, in fact.
This brutal campaign, a new addition to the Politburo Standing Committee. The 52-year-old Deng Xiaoping.
Keep an eye on him.
A veteran of the Long March. He will become a crucial figure in the years ahead.
Yeah. The thoughts of the chairman are always correct. If we encounter any problem, any difficulty, it is because we have not followed the instructions of the chairman closely enough. That's what we call a cult of personality right there. Great leap forward. 58 to 62.
1958. The start of a second 5-year plan. This time, even more ambitious.
Yeah.
Mao calls it the Great Leap Forward, a huge program to create a truly socialist state and dramatically expand industrial output.
I'll say more ambitious is right. I talked about the costs of the Soviet plans, but the cost here is going to be disproportionately much, much more extreme.
To catch up with the world's leading economies. A huge public information campaign spreads the message throughout the country, urging every Chinese citizen to rise to the challenge and embrace Mao's leadership. Existing rural cooperatives are merged into vast people's communes, in which the party controls every aspect of daily life. The state now owns the land, buys harvests, and distributes rations.
But one thing I will say about this, which is interesting, they talk about the state and the party, which were, of course, very powerful forces. But one of the things that made Mao, maybe not unique, he's not the only one to do this, but the extent of it made him unique, was his ability to mobilize popular support, right? Mao had genuine support among a lot of people in China, right? Whenever he came out with something new, he could mobilize many, many people to go out and sort of work his political agenda. Now, I say maybe not unique because other political leaders have done that over time, but really the extent of it with Mao is that he was always focused on mass mobilization. So when we talk about the party or the state having control, that is true, but that was only really enabled by the mass mobilization that led from Mao, that he was able to encourage with his words and his actions. Of course, we'll see a lot of people are not in favor of what happens. We saw that criticism flooding in. A lot of people will be punished. But there were a lot of people who were in favor of everything in varying degrees, and they were really following Mao's every word. And so when he called for popular participation, a lot of people really did listen. So that's something that makes this, sort of interesting.
Private kitchens are banned as representing selfish individualism and replaced by communal canteens. Very quickly, the Great Leap Forward's ambitions become detached from reality.
Yeah.
Many of the technicians and experts who should have overseen the campaign have been purged. Under intense pressure to meet unrealistic targets, local party officials exaggerate harvest figures.
Classic.
These
Same thing that happened in the Soviet Union as well, right? When you've got these set targets you have to meet, well, especially if you're living in communist China or the Soviet Union, you're going to meet those targets, right? Whether that means actually meeting them materially or lying about it. That was one of the things Gorbachev encountered when he tried to reform, is he went around to all these factories and he was like, all these numbers are lies. None of these are true. None of these quotas are actually being met, right? And that's one of the things we see here, where people are so afraid not to meet the target that they're going to meet it one way or another, even if they're just making up numbers, or if they have to pull other types of shenanigans to meet that target, they will.
inflated reports suggest large surpluses of grain, which is then taken from the communes
Right.
to supply the cities.
Right, and of course the issue there is that then you, as the government, you do not know how much grain you actually have. You don't know how much food you have, right? And since you're centrally planning your economy, you're running everything, you're operating on those statistics you have, well, it's very easy to create a disaster relying on these bogus numbers, right?
In reality, this means far too much grain is taken from the communes,
Yeah.
often leaving them without enough to feed themselves.
Yeah, this is where disaster comes.
Drought, mismanagement, and corruption actually mean agricultural production is in steep decline.
So you got steeply declining agricultural production, but at the same time, all these communes are lying and saying they're hitting their targets, and so the state is just taking more and more of that grain, just leaving people with less and less food.
Millions of peasants now face starvation. On top of this, farmers face new nonsensical demands, like an order to use homemade foundries to produce iron,
Yep.
often of such poor quality it's unusable.
And so the pig iron they were producing, which, like they said, oftentimes wasn't even usable, right? It's just, it's kind of difficult to have a cottage industry of iron producers around the country. Turns out it doesn't work super well.
The result is a disastrous famine across China. By some recent estimates, Mao's Great Leap Forward is responsible for at least 45 million excess deaths,
Jesus Christ.
around 7% of the population.
That's crazy.
It ranks as one of the greatest man-made disasters
Yeah.
in history.
This is why I say, when I say that the results here were worse than the USSR, it was not to downplay any of the atrocities or even the famines that happened in the Soviet Union as a result of industrialization, but this is really on another scale.
In the most hard-pressed areas, whole communes starved to death.
Basketball hoops? Sorry.
Famine had always been a feature of life and death in China. But the winter of 1960 is perhaps the darkest hour in the country's history.
Yeah.
Reports of widespread chaos and suffering eventually seep through to the upper echelons of the party. In the summer of 1959, at a conference in Lushan, Minister of Defense Peng Dehuai openly denounces the Great Leap Forward and Mao's leadership. Mao is not in listening mood. Peng is placed under house arrest and removed from office. His replacement, General Lin Biao, is one of Mao's most loyal supporters.
So, I mean, what we have here is a combination of the government actually being obtuse, as in not getting the information it needs, but then to a certain extent being purposefully obtuse, right? Not willing to look at the signs of disaster, not willing to hear criticism, really a combination of the two.
But as the months go by, the evidence becomes impossible to ignore.
Yeah.
When news of the famine reaches Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek seeks to humiliate Mao by ordering airdrops of food to the mainland. By 1961, the party has to acknowledge reality.
Yeah.
Mao Zedong publicly accepts that mistakes were made. He remains chairman of the Chinese Communist Party.
Mistakes were made. Pretty light way to put it. I guess it's more than you can get out of, I don't know, like Stalin. But that's, pretty much underselling. Very much underselling the situation.
But for the next few years, he steps back from frontline politics.
That is true, though. That is true. This is a moment. I mean, look, Mao is not gone for good. But this does, it's sort of funny to say that a disaster of this scale, the consequences for the leadership are pretty minor. But what is true is that Mao is forced to step back, and he does lose influence for a few years, right? So this is sort of a low point in terms of the influence Mao has. Now, he'll be back, but this is not his moment.
In his place, more pragmatic leaders, notably Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping, take on the day-to-day business of government.
Yeah, a few guys who will have influence. They'll be challenged in the future. They'll struggle, but in the long run, these guys are going to be pretty important to the development of China in sort of moving forward.
Some of the policies that had led to the famine are abandoned. Communes are reduced in size, communal canteens are abandoned, and some land returns to private ownership. But the party still controls all aspects of daily life, providing everything from healthcare to housing.
And I will say, I mentioned they mentioned how Mao taking a step back, and I said, well, he'll be back. Of course, this is a real low moment. I mean, for everybody, for the party. But if you're unfamiliar, you might be shocked to learn that, Mao has not lost all his support. When he comes back, once again, he will be able to mobilize a lot of people, right? So he's not down and out. But, of course, this is a real low moment. For many people, a moment of tragedy and chaos and losing a lot of their faith in what's going on, especially in this sort of era.
Education and employment, while food remains rationed. The work unit, not the family, is the basic unit of social and economic existence. Meanwhile, in 1958, the government adopts a new phonetic alphabet to encourage literacy in China. It is called Pinyin, and becomes the new system for the romanization of Chinese names.
Right.
Peking becomes Beijing. Canton becomes Guangzhou.
I mean, and this is why still in some Western books or textbooks or whatever, you'll still see some discrepancy especially if you're reading something that's a little older between some of these different names. And there's still sort of confusion about a lot of names today among English speakers.
Nanking becomes Nanjing,
See, that's one that really trips
with
people up.
countless more changes. Pinyin spreads only slowly across China itself, and it is not until the 1980s that the new names are taken up abroad.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. It's not like it was immediately adopted everywhere. Even then, you've got a while to go, right? So now today, you don't really see anyone talking about Peking anymore. Maybe a little bit. It's always Beijing. But you'll hear Nanking, Nanjing. You'll hear them often used interchangeably, right? Like I said, there's a lot of these different proper nouns that the old version is still used. Right? So this is an interesting one. People all over the world are now discussing whether a third world war will break out. If the imperialists insist on unleashing another war, we should not be afraid of it. We should be afraid. I'm afraid. Foreign confrontation, 58 to 66.
While enacting the Great Leap Forward at home, Mao takes an increasingly aggressive approach abroad.
And, I mean, we'll see maybe some of his actions taken, but also ideologically, Mao is pretty influential. You might have heard of sort of Maoist third worldists, right? The Maoist ideology spreads, in part because of its focus on, as we saw in China, a sense of nationalism, a sense of anti-imperialism, and also land redistribution. These are things that are all pretty relevant to a lot of colonized countries around the world. We talked about how the Bolsheviks, they had more of a focus on the urban proletariat, even though Russia at the time was still very agricultural. Now, they'll sort of shift over the years, but when we look at places around the world, especially outside of the Western world, we're often not talking about places that have a big urban proletariat. And so perhaps what Mao is saying is a little more attractive. I mentioned the example of Mexico earlier, not in the sense that they were influenced by Mao, but the point I was making there is that they had socialist and communist movements that, really were deeply involved with land redistribution, right? That'll be pretty important to a lot of these movements and to a lot of the anti-colonial movements and nationalist movements that take up some type of communist ideology. Not always Maoism, but sometimes Maoism.
In August 1958, the Chinese
But of
army...
course, that's ideological. We've, of course, also got the actions of the Chinese state.
In August 1958, the Chinese army starts shelling islands in the Taiwan Strait, belonging to the Republic of China, testing nationalist defenses. The US response is emphatic, sending naval and air reinforcements to the region, and deciding to use nuclear weapons if necessary.
Oh, God.
It is one of the world's first serious nuclear crises.
Not the last.
The situation eventually reverts to a hostile standoff. But Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who is pursuing a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, is furious at Mao's recklessness.
Yeah, so we've talked about the tensions between the USSR and China. Really, just the tensions emerged, I think, from the fact that there were two big dogs in the same neighborhood. You know what I mean? The USSR and China, the two biggest communist powers, they were gonna butt heads. But now, post-Stalin, it turns out that Khrushchev, he gets along with Mao and the Chinese even less than Stalin did.
Relations between China and the Soviet Union, the world's two great communist states, are in steep decline.
Yeah.
In 1956, Khrushchev had denounced the excesses of Stalinism and the cult of personality. Mao is outraged by these views, and in turn denounces Khrushchev's views as a betrayal of communism.
Yeah, I think Mao is upset, in part because, Khrushchev is criticizing of Stalin everything that Mao is doing. So he's like, hey, wait a minute. You can't be criticizing the cult of personality. That's what I've got going on. And so, they do the whole, Mao says, you're a revisionist, you're moving away from true communism, etc., etc. And Khrushchev is like, well, look at all the people that died. This is clearly bad. And so now the split is really emerging here.
In his eyes, the Soviet Union has gone soft. It is a fatal ideological split. And after 1959, the two leaders will never meet again.
Now, of course, in this moment, you really could not imagine the US sort of getting in there and trying to befriend one of those two states. But if you sort of look ahead to the future, this split between the two biggest communist powers, that creates an opportunity for the United States. And the US will eventually take that opportunity, but not quite yet.
That year, China faces a revolt against its rule in Tibet. In response, the Chinese army shells Lhasa. The uprising ends after 3 days of bloody street fighting. The Dalai Lama and 80,000 Tibetans flee to India.
Wow.
From now on, Tibet is under direct Chinese rule. In 1962, tension on the Himalayan border between China and India explodes into a month of fighting as China grabs disputed territory.
And of course, wants not to keep making this same point, but that tension still exists between China and India, right? They've still got a lot of tension between them that sometimes grows into a little more than tension. So that's another really flashpoint where some larger conflict could emerge. Even today, that tension still exists.
Tellingly, the Soviet Union backs India, not China. A sign of how far their relationship has broken down. The Soviets have already withdrawn all technical support for Chinese weapons programs. But China is no longer so reliant on foreign expertise. 1958, for example, had seen the founding of the University of Science and Technology of China in Peking. And in 1964, at Lop Nor in Xinjiang province, China tests its first atomic bomb.
Yeah. And I think that the split between the Soviets and the Chinese that's emerging, of course, there's an ideological basis, but there's also a material basis, which is the Soviets know a rival when they see one, right? And sort of vice versa from China. And of course, China is the one on the rise, whereas the Soviets are a little stagnant at this point. China will grow to rival and then, of course, surpass, Soviets or Russia or whatever you want to say. And the USSR can see China is on the rise. And so once again, there's that natural tension just based on the two countries, their material circumstances, and how each of them is or is not growing. I think a lot of the ideological split sort of goes back to that reality.
Two years later, it detonates its first thermonuclear device. China has joined the United States, Soviet Union, Britain and France to become the world's fifth nuclear power,
Right.
adopting a no-first-use nuclear policy. There is no longer any question that China stands on its own feet as a major world power.
Oh, yeah.
But Mao and the Chinese Communist Party still see much work to do. Their next battleground will be within Chinese society itself.
The Epic History team
Whoa.
uses heaps of technology to make our videos, from
Fourth wall break.
laptops and drives to headphones, microphones, and of course the dreaded cables. And when we're off on our travels, we all know how difficult it can be to keep those things organized.
I believe we're getting an advertisement here. So there you go. I'll link their video down below.
Description. Use it now to start browsing the huge range of products at Bellroy.com.
There you go.
And get 10% off everything.
We want to show them some support for making these fantastic videos. Their video's linked down below. You should go give it a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. All right, another episode in their Rise of China series. I've really enjoyed this one so far. I know there's more to come. They've done a good job with it. I always think modern Chinese history is truly fascinating. And now we're getting into really the modern age of the People's Republic, right? So some really interesting stuff. They've just achieved their first nuke. You know, nuclear proliferation. We're heading to a world where every country needs at least one, clearly. That can't be good. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this one as well. If you did, you can leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon, which is linked down below, and I'll give you access to exclusive reaction videos. With that, hope you guys are having a fantastic day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.